When you think of Fletcher-class destroyers, you probably think of the conflict in the Pacific, where these ships fought against the Japanese Navy. You probably don't think of Fletcher serving in Japan. However, two of these ships did serve in the Maritime Self-Defense Force. And in today's video, we'll be looking at one of those, USS Heywood L. Edwards, a ship that fought against the Japanese, before ending her service as JDS Ariake of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. Quite an interesting turnaround when you think about it. But before that, we do need to look at her life as Edwards. In this case, that story begins in the Boston Navy Yard. The ship that became Heywood L. Edwards was laid down there on July 4th, 1943. Nothing noteworthy here other than it being the 4th of July. No, where things become notable is in the pace of construction. Edwards was launched on October 6th, 1943. Only a couple months after her keel was laid, the ship was already in the water, and that pace continued into fitting out, with Edwards commissioning a few months later on January 26th of 1944. This is a sign of just how fast American shipyards were pushing out destroyers at the height of the war. There's a bit of a meme in naval history circles on this topic. The Navy going to Congress to ask them to, please stop ordering destroyers, we don't have enough crew for them. All joking aside, this fast pace of construction still saw Heywood L. Edwards join the fleet in 1944. She would only see the last 2 years of the war, but that does not mean her life was a quiet one. This ship would ultimately earn 7 battle stars, as well as a Navy unit commendation. That second point in particular will receive focus later on. However, we'll get to that after a short detour into design. As the Fletcher-class is quite well known, this will just be the basics. Fletcher-class destroyers displaced around 2,000 tons at their standard loading, going up to around 2,500 tons when fully loaded, although this would vary between ships depending on their anti-aircraft loadout and other related factors. On that displacement, the ships carried 5 of the ubiquitous 5-inch 38 caliber gun, and 5 single mounts in the typical American destroyer layout. A super-firing pair on the bow, matched by a second pair on the stern, with the 5th mount carried alone, just ahead of the aft superstructure. These were supported by the mimetic bolt-a-gun anywhere it fits anti-aircraft battery. Exact numbers and layouts varied from ship to ship and from time period to time period. Regardless, it was a mix of 20mm cannon and 40mm Bofors. What didn't vary, a couple exceptions aside, was the torpedo battery. 10 21-inch torpedoes in 2 quintuple mounts, both carried directly amidships. To round things off in terms of weaponry, the Fletchers also carried depth charges on their stern, and all of this equipment could reach around 35 knots on 60,000 shaft horsepower. Which brings us to the end of the design. A bit more detail than when I covered Willie D. Porter, but this will be relevant when we reach Edwards' Japanese service, although that does come later. For now, Edwards began her shakedown cruise on February 25th, 1944. Nothing really notable, and it ended in short order. By mid-April, the destroyer was off to the Pacific. Edwards transited the Panama Canal on April 16th to join up with the Pacific Fleet. The destroyer would do so on May 8th after arriving in Pearl Harbor, where she joined up with Task Force 52 for training. As such, Edwards spent her initial service as a screening unit for the transports, which, granted, wasn't that much different than other ships. It was escort the transports or escort the carriers, as the close-in fighting in the Solomons was over. At least escorting the transports allowed for naval bombardment missions, which, as it turned out, was the first taste of combat for USS Heywood L. Edwards. On May 29, 1944, Edwards left Pearl Harbor. She escorted the landing force for the invasion of the Marianas. This group arrived off Saipan, commencing that invasion on June 15th. Edwards would close in on the beaches to provide gunnery support from June 21st to July 2nd, after which there was a brief detour to Tinian, lasting until July 6th, at which point Edwards returned to Saipan and her support role off that island, which actually saw a moment of excitement past the monotony of shore bombardment. On the night of July 7th, a group of soldiers reached a beach. These men, 44 in all, had been cut off from American lines and required rescue. Heywood L. Edwards was assigned to this task. The destroyer closed in on the beach, where her whaleboat would make 4 trips to pick up the stranded men. This was not easy, as the reefs in the area were quite dangerous. Nonetheless, it was a success. With the 44 soldiers transferred to another ship, Edwards returned to her old duty, including another detour to Tinian from July 19th to July 21st, before ultimately leaving the area on July 30th for a voyage to Eniwetok. Things quieted down at that point until the next major amphibious operation. Edwards would spend August of 1944 on rest and training, including an exercise on August 18th. This reprieve was, of course, short-lived. Come September, the next operation began. This was the Battle of Peleliu, a meat grinder for the Marines ashore, but one where Edwards mostly continued as she had in the Marianas. At first, from September 11th to September 13th, she covered the battleships and cruisers. And then on September 13th, a couple days before the invasion proper, Edwards covered demolition teams. There were no issues during this. And 2 days later, on September 15th, the destroyer would cover the actual invasion, including hitting an ammunition dump, creating an impressive fireball ashore. This was already a good success, but it was followed up with another on September 23rd. Just after midnight, Edwards spotted a group of Japanese barges carrying reinforcements. Star shells were promptly sent up, illuminating the target, and Heywood L. Edwards opened fire, sinking 14 barges. This came out to around 650 Japanese troops that otherwise might have made it ashore, at least according to the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships. In any case, Edwards would depart Peleliu soon after this, arriving in the Admiralty Islands on October 1st to shift formation. The destroyer joined up with Admiral Oldendorf's bombardment group for the liberation of the Philippines. That group is well known, of course, for what came in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which would be the next major action for USS Heywood L. Edwards. First, the destroyer left for Leyte on October 12, 1944. Then, from October 18th through the 24th, the destroyer provided gunfire support, while fending off Japanese air attack. On October 24th, however, things changed. The Japanese began to move in towards the landings, leading to the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea off to the north. With more Japanese forces coming in from the south, Edwards moved to a blocking position. As part of Oldendorf's group, she lay in wait in the Surigao Strait. This would see the southern force obliterated. Only 2 Japanese ships escaped the Battle of Surigao Strait, Mogami and Shigure, and the cruiser Mogami would be sunk soon after. During this action, Edwards led the 3rd section of Destroyer Squadron 56. This initially involved screening the cruisers in the opening phase of the action. However, after the first destroyer and PT boat attacks, this would change. Around 3 a.m. on October 25th, Edwards went in for her only surface battle. Despite Japanese return fire, the destroyer made a successful torpedo run. This saw torpedo hits on the battleship Yamashiro, although it's difficult to judge which destroyer made the hits. Edwards, meanwhile, avoided any damage in return. The destroyer would return to escorting the cruisers, while the standard battleships pounded Yamashiro. The destroyer would then join the cruisers in hunting for stragglers come morning. However, Edwards wouldn't fire on any more Japanese warships. With the end of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Edwards returned to shore bombardment. This would see the destroyer in the Philippines until November 25th. That said, there were no other major events, so Edwards would depart the area on November 25th to receive some desperately needed refit. Although this would be short-lived, Edwards rejoined the fleet on December 15th before sailing back to the Philippines on January 1st. This saw the ship provide more gunfire support during the landings on Luzon. Heywood L. Edwards fought off kamikaze attacks during this process, until leaving the area on January 22nd, not to return home, but to join the forces for the Battle of Iwo Jima. Edwards continued her relentless pace of shore bombardment, arriving off Iwo Jima on February 16th of 1945, where she would once again support the landings that began on February 19th, lasting in this case until February 27th, at which point Edwards returned to Saipan for a brief break before sailing for Okinawa. Yet another landing operation, yet more shore bombardments, and fending off more kamikazes. This began on March 25th of 1945 for operations to capture the Kurama Islands, and on March 27th it saw a large kamikaze attack, which Edwards helped fend off, shooting down quite a few aircraft in the process. After this, she would join the main Okinawa landings, first by covering the demolition teams on March 30th, including bombarding an airfield, and then on April 1st, covering the main landing. This involved a lot of firing ashore and a lot of kamikazes. Through it all, USS Heywood L. Edwards performed her job very well, including a notable incident on May 18th. USS Longshaw ran aground, and Edwards would knock out shore batteries, firing on her stranded sister ship. It wasn't enough to save the other Fletcher, but it did help with rescuing the crew. Edwards would remain off Okinawa until July 28th. This was, however, the end of her combat service. Edwards returned to Leyte on July 28th, 1945, and she wouldn't return to direct combat before Japan surrendered. Instead, she supported the occupation of Japan in September, before returning to the United States for the first time since the ship joined the war. This saw Edwards arrive in Seattle on November 10th, 1945. USS Heywood L. Edwards would then be decommissioned on July 1st of 1946, and she would remain in reserve until being loaned to Japan in 1959. Now, one last note before we cover that service. Remember the unit commendation that I mentioned earlier? That was for Edwards, although the recommendation included her sister ship, USS Richard P. Leary. I'll link the text of the recommendation in the description. However, a couple notable bits from that text. First, Edwards fired a total of rounds equivalent to 4 times the normal life of her guns. Second, she participated in the 6 major amphibious operations from 1944 through 1945, providing accurate and useful support in each and every one. At Okinawa, the commander of the landings basically said this: "No, these ships are too good. We can't spare them," when asked to let Edwards and Leary head for rest. And finally, neither of these 2 destroyers were ever hit. That's a mix of luck and pure skill of the crews. Edwards didn't have the big fancy things, but it's hard to find a more successful ship in the more mundane work. Incidentally, Leary was the other destroyer loaned to Japan in 1959. That transfer came on March 10th of 1959. These two Fletchers would enter Japanese service as the Ariake class. Edwards became JDS Ariake, while Leary became JDS Yugure, taking the name of the last two Hatsuharu-class destroyers lost during the war. Details on the service in Japan is fairly sparse. This isn't a surprise. In doing these videos, I found that American ships, be they loaned or sold, often have sparse service histories in their new home. Still, I've done some digging and can say a couple things. First, that the destroyers were transferred as training ships. This saw the torpedoes removed, along with one of the 5-inch guns, replaced by extra classroom space to fit their new role. You can see that in a picture of Ariake in 1961. No torpedoes and a missing gun mount. This wasn't without issues, however. Ariake suffered a breakage in her turbines during her sea trials. This delayed her recommissioning until April 21st of 1960, at which point the destroyer would be used on training cruises. During this process, the number 2 gun mount was removed, replaced by an anti-submarine rocket thrower. This was done at some point before this picture was taken in 1966. A final major refit followed in 1970. This saw the entire bow cut out and replaced with a new design. The remaining bow gun was removed, replaced by new sonar equipment and living quarters. This added 230 tons to the ship and resulted in an interesting looking design. However, it was only a short reprieve. Ariake was decommissioned on March 9th, 1974, and ultimately scrapped in Taiwan in 1976. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.